agreement. More than 24 House Democrats sent a letter to Secretary of State Anthony Blinken earlier this week calling for diplomatic pressure to prevent the displacement of Palestinians from East Jerusalem. And Senator Bernie Sanders wrote in the New York Times that the U.S. must stop being an apologist for the Netanyahu government. But so far, Democrat leaders like Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi aren't joining those calls.
I think the president took the appropriate, proportionate response to it all. The fact is that we have a very close relationship with Israel, and Israel's security is a national security issue for us as our friend, a democratic country in the region.
Israel took heavy criticism after an airstrike razed a building in Gaza that housed the offices of the Associated Press. Netanyahu said he showed evidence to the U.S. that the building housed a terrorist command center. Dale Hurd, CBN News.
Israel has been under attack.
Yeah.
And our leaders in our country are wanting us to take the side of those who've attacked Israel. What do you think about this?
I think that we definitely need to be siding with Israel. There's so much fake news out there. I even saw a video from a good friend of mine who lives in Israel of when that building was destroyed that they just talked about, that housed not only Hamas, but also the Associated Press, where the owner of the building was on the phone talking to the IDF who was about to bomb the building. He acknowledged that they had every right to do it, and they had given him a 1-hour notice. So they were given an hour notice. What country gives an hour notice to another enemy that they're about to bomb this building? There's so much fake news that's rampant out there. It's horrible. But the problem with Israel, they're just as divided as the United States is. Their politics, they're about to enter their 5th election. And I think one of the main reasons why both the political system in Israel and the United States is divided is because they have the dividing of the land of Israel on the table right now. And as God says in the Joel, he will come against anyone who tries to divide his land.
Now let's turn our attention to something we haven't talked about in a while, the blood moons. For those in our audience who are not familiar with the blood moons, can you give us a brief explanation of what a blood moon is and why it's important prophetically?
Blood moon is a total lunar eclipse. This is when you have the earth and the moon and the sun in an alignment where the earth comes between the sun and the moon and blocks out the sunlight from hitting the moon. And so the moon turns blood red. That's what causes a blood moon. Well, all through the Bible, we hear about the moon turning to blood in the last days. Well, guess what? In Genesis chapter 1, verse 14 is one of the most misunderstood verses in the Bible. That's where it says that God created the sun and the moon. The number one reason, he says, is for signs. Well, that specifically is referring to an eclipse. And so we see that God has a timetable, and we need to understand his way of communicating to mankind from the heavens, which speaks in every tribe, nation, language, and tongue.
These programs that are usually I don't give you the date, but these programs we're actually taping them at this minute.
That's right.
And they air on May 25 and May 26.
That's right.
And so tell us what those 2 dates are about, May 25 and 26.
Well, what we have on May 26th, this is when you're going to have a total lunar eclipse that's going to appear over Asia, Australia, the Pacific, and the Americas. Well, what's fascinating is we just celebrated the Feast of Pentecost, or Shavuot. This is in the month of Sivan. And as you mentioned earlier, just like we had these 4 blood moons before the last Shemitah cycle leading into the Shemitah cycle, we also now have 4 blood moons coming into this next Shemaitah cycle, the Shemaitah year ending the 7-year, and then the first year of the next one. And so they're May 26th and November 19th, followed by May 16th and November 8th. One of them is a partial, the one in November of this year. But here we have these 4 back-to-back blood moons, which I think have great significance that God is trying to tell us something.
You believe the blood moons are God's way of communicating to earth, to mankind?
And the solar eclipses, both of them.
You know, a super blood moon, some rabbis in Israel are saying that this super blood moon is a forte of war. Do you agree?
Yes.
Do you agree with that?
Yes, and what they say, first off, let me explain a super blood moon. The moon's orbit around the Earth is elliptical. So sometimes it's very far away, sometimes it's real close. A super blood moon is when we have an eclipse when it's real close, at its closest point to Earth. Now, over 2,000 years ago, the Jewish rabbis have said because a solar eclipse, the sun is much bigger than the moon, and because the pagans, their calendar is based on the sun, which is what ours is, and Israel's much smaller, and their calendar is based on the moon, a solar eclipse means judgment is coming upon the nations when the eclipse goes over that nation, and a lunar eclipse refers to judgment upon Israel. So that's the difference between the two.
So they're believing that these blood moons signal war coming to Israel.
Well, we have war right now. I mean, it is going on. We'll see if it continues to go on as well.
This May 26th supermoon is the first of the 4 blood moons that will take place between now and November 2022. Would you explain when these will occur, what the significance is of these blood moons?
What we have here coming up, May 26th, as you said, is the one that is in this particular biblical calendar year. And then this November, now this coming Rosh Hashanah begins the Shemitah year, or the 7th year of the 7-year cycle. So there's one this November, which takes place a week before Hanukkah, which I think is very significant, because Hanukkah speaks of both physical and spiritual war that's going on. Then next year, it's on May 16th of 2022, and all 4 of these are seen over the United States, or the Americas, Europe, okay? So that's very important. Well, the one in May of next year, a year from now, is in the month of Iyar, which is the very year that Amalek attacked. And so could we see another war in Iyar attacking Israel then? And that this is followed by the one on November 8th of 2022. Now that one will be in the first year of the new 7-year cycle, and it takes place in the month of Heshvan, 2 days historically before the Noah's flood took place.
Interesting.
Wow.
Can you explain what the Shemitah cycle is for those who may not be familiar with that term?
Okay, so God has a time clock, and we need to understand, just like a grandfather's clock has gears to keep us on God's timetable, we need to know God's appointed times, and we need to, we're his servants. So he doesn't come at our beck and call, we're to come at his beck and call. And so within the gears of this grandfather's clock, so to speak, we have the weekly gears of the Shabbat, the monthly gear of the new moons. We have the yearly festivals like Passover, Pentecost. All of these are known as the Moedim, or appointed times. So then we have the yearly gears of the Moedim. But then we have the 7th year of the 7th year cycle, which is called the Shemitah. And then every 50th year is the year of Jubilee. Now, one thing I want to point out, this is going to set this program up. We are right now in the year 5781. This coming Rosh Hashanah begins the year 5782. So their calendar is different than ours. But let me show you this, Jim. This will be very, I think, significant to you individually as well. But look at this. In Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 1 through 2, God says, when all these things come upon you, the blessing and the curse, which I've set before you, and you call them to mind among all the nations where the Lord your God has driven you, and you return to the Lord your God, you and your children, you obey his voice and all that I command you today with all your heart, with all your soul. Look what happens in Deuteronomy 30, verse 3. It says, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes. He'll have mercy on you. He will gather you again from all the nations or the people where the Lord your God has scattered you. Do you know this is the 5,708th verse of the Bible? Well, guess what? That also was the year 1948. The year 5708 on the Hebrew calendar was our 1948, and this very verse was fulfilled that year.
Wow.
Wow.
That's
Yeah.
powerful.
But
Wow.
let me go back to the PowerPoint. Let me just show you now the answer to your question. I want you to see this. What I made here, and this is what blew me away. I'm telling you, this is going to rock everybody's world. I took 70 years. I have 10 Shemaitah cycles, so everyone can know where we're at. Going horizontally, you can see the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh year. 1966, 1967 was the Hebrew year 5727. And it was right then when the four blood moons appeared, when they recaptured Jerusalem at the Six-Day War. And then you go to the right, you see the seventh year was 1972, 1973, which was the year 5733. Now people ask, how do I know that's a Shemaitah year? It's so simple. The Hebrew year is divisible by 7. It's that easy. And so look at the next 7-year cycle. So many people focus on the Shemaitah year. You really need to focus on the first year of every Shemaitah cycle. Look at 73, 74. You have the Yom Kippur War. Look at 1980-81. You have the Israeli jets destroy the Iraq nuclear reactor. So I'm going to go across and watch what happens here. Here, 1987, 1988 was the first Intifada. 1994, 1995, this is incredible. This was when Israel entered a peace treaty with Jordan. That was the year 5755. Guess what? The Bible verse for that year is Deuteronomy 31:30, which begins the song of Moses that's sung in the book of Revelation. So this is powerful. God did not want them creating a covenant with the foreign nations. And then that brings us to 2001, 2002. That's Operation Defensive Shield. It's the second Intifada. And guess what happened in 2001, 2002? That's when the quartet was established. Okay, that's the United Nations, the EU, the United States, and Russia. They decide in 2001 and 2002 that Israel needs to be divided and a Palestinian state needs to be created. And then lastly on this slide is 2008, 2009, which is the Gaza war, the stock market crash. Okay, now hold your seats. Here comes the mind-blowing one. First off, 2015, 2016, again, set off by the four blood moons. What is the meaning of these four blood moons in 48, in 67, in 2014, 2015? I believe these eclipses were a warning of what will be coming even 7 years later. And here's what I mean by that. Look what happens right now. If you look at that chart, we are at 2020, 2021, which is the year 5781. So that is the 6th year of a 7-year cycle, which means this Rosh Hashanah, we begin the 7th year. Next Rosh Hashanah is the key critical date everyone needs to write down, because 2022, 2023 Rosh Hashanah is the beginning of a new 7-year cycle. Now, let me explain to you the phenomenal part of this. I believe every one of your audience knows about Daniel's 70 weeks and how there's 1 week of 7 years left, right? Does everybody realize that? Well, guess what? If that's the case, we have to remember Daniel was Jewish. And the whole thing about the Shemitah cycle, they went into captivity because they did not honor the Shemitah year. And so the Shemitah cycle is very important to God. So are you ready to write this down? You got to get a hold of this. Because God is on his own calendar, the 7-year tribulation cannot start anytime randomly. The 7-year tribulation, because there's 1 week left, has to begin the beginning of a 7-year cycle. So if you look at this calendar, the beginning of the next 7-year cycle is a year from now, on Rosh Hashanah 2022, 2023. Now, if the tribulation does not begin then, it can't begin until 2029 or 2030. And if not then, it can't begin until 7 years later, 2036, 2037. So that's the first thing I want people to understand. The tribulation cannot be any moment. That week is a Shemitah week, and it has to begin the first year of a Shemitah cycle.
Wow. That is mind-blowing. Wow.
So what is the next first date that the tribulation period can begin?
Next year.
Next year.
Rosh Hashanah next year.
Wow.
Could be the beginning of the tribulation.
And if it's not, it can't begin for another 7 years because it's a Shemitah week. It's not just 7 years, it's a Shemitah week, which has to begin the first year of a Shemitah cycle.
What are the odds of it happening next year?
Well, that's what the rest of this show is going to be about. That's what I want to show you.
Well, it's
mind-blowing.
It's so powerful.
It really
And people
is.
ignore it, and people say, well, the blood moons came and nothing happened. Have you heard people say that?
Oh, of course. That's because they don't understand what God is doing and saying. God always gives warning. And if you remember, in Egypt, I want to emphasize in Egypt, with Pharaoh's dream, there was a 7-year warning before the 7 years of famine. They had 7 years of plenty. Well, I don't know if your audience knows this, but Jewish history, and I can prove it biblically, Joseph came up out of the pit on Rosh Hashanah, okay? And that 7 years was the beginning of a 7-year Shemitah cycle. And so even then it was based on the Shemitah cycle. And it was on Rosh Hashanah.
That's amazing. That's amazing in itself.
I've got to stop right now and ask people to go ahead and order today's thing so you can study this,
right.
have it for your own Bible studies. Your pastor needs this material. And our brand new calendar, let the Shemaitah begin, it says on the front of this calendar, and the Jubilee follow. And so this is the new calendar that is just coming off the press,
That's right.
coming to your house.